The bell above the door jingled as Ethan Carter strode into Rosie's diner, his designer sunglasses pushed up onto his head, his expensive watch catching the overhead light. He barely spared a glance at the people inside as he made his way to the counter, tapping his fingers impatiently. The diner was packed, locals sipping coffee, chatting, taking life slow in a way that irritated him. He had no patience for small-town nonsense. He was only here because his Tesla's GPS had taken him on a ridiculous backroad detour on the way to his resort. He checked his watch again. 5 minutes wasted already. Behind the counter, the waitress, a young woman with tired eyes and a sharp wit, wiped her hands on a rag and walked over. "Morning, sir. What can I get you?" "Black coffee, extra hot," Ethan said, barely looking at her, "and make it quick." She nodded, unfazed by his attitude. She'd dealt with his type before. "Hello, Mr. Pictures here, and before we continue with the story, please subscribe to the channel as it would allow me to continue with these stories. Thank you. Now back to the story." As she turned to prepare his drink, Ethan finally took a moment to glance around the diner, and that's when he noticed them. At a corner booth sat 4 older men, deep in conversation. Their clothes were simple, worn jeans, flannel shirts. But there was something about them, a certain presence, the kind of weight a man carried when he had been through hell and back. One of them, an older man with silver hair and sharp blue eyes, was in the middle of telling a story. His voice was steady, his words careful, but there was a fire in them, a fire that spoke of things seen, of battles fought, of sacrifices made. Ethan rolled his eyes. He had heard enough of these kinds of stories before. Old men clinging to the past, acting like they were the backbone of the country. The waitress set his coffee down in front of him. "That guy," Ethan said, nodding toward the booth. "What's his deal?" She stiffened slightly. "That's Jim Reynolds, retired Marine. He runs the town's Veterans Center." Ethan snorted. "Figures." The waitress frowned. "Figures?" "Yeah." He took a sip of coffee, smirking. "You ever notice how military guys are always the loudest ones in the room? Always going on about duty and honor like it makes them special?" The diner's conversation lulled. People were listening now. The waitress's face hardened. "That man spent 3 decades serving his country." Ethan chuckled. "And what does he do now? Sit around telling war stories and waiting for people to thank him?" A chair scraped against the floor. Jim Reynolds had stood up. Ethan turned, taking another sip of coffee, completely unbothered. Jim walked over, slow and deliberate, stopping just a few feet from Ethan. His face was calm, but his eyes carried something cold. "You got a real loose mouth, son," Jim said, his voice quiet but firm. Ethan smirked. "Yeah? And what are you gonna do about it, old man?" The diner went completely silent. The tension was thick enough to choke on. Jim didn't move, didn't react. He just stared. And for the first time since walking in, Ethan felt something shift in the air. Something he didn't understand yet. But he was about to. He was about to learn the hard way. The silence in Rosie's diner stretched on, thick and suffocating. Every pair of eyes in the room was fixed on Jim Reynolds and Ethan Carter, the tension between them palpable, electric. Ethan leaned against the counter, his smirk unwavering. He was used to getting his way, used to brushing off uncomfortable moments with arrogance and money. Jim Reynolds, however, wasn't just another old man waiting to be ignored. "You think men like me talk too much," Jim said finally, his voice steady, controlled. "You think we sit around, swapping war stories for attention?" Ethan scoffed. "I think you like to live in the past. You want people to pat you on the back for something you did decades ago. Meanwhile, the rest of us, we move on." Jim nodded slowly as if considering the words. "You ever hold a man's hand while he bled out?" he asked. Ethan frowned. "What?" Jim stepped forward, closing the space between them, his eyes hard and unreadable. "You ever feel the heat of a gun barrel next to your ear? Smell the iron in the air after a man's been shot? Watch a kid, barely 18, take his last breath while calling for a mother who ain't there?" Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Jim continued, his voice low but powerful, each word hitting like a hammer. "You ever have to kill a man before he kills you? Not in a movie, not in some sanitized version of reality, but up close, real, where you can see the life leave his eyes?" Ethan shifted uncomfortably. The waitress folded her arms, staring at him, waiting. The other veterans in the diner sat still as statues, their faces unreadable, but their presence loomed like ghosts of a past Ethan would never understand. Jim exhaled, his gaze unwavering. "I have," he said. The words hung in the air, heavy, unshakable. Ethan let out a breath, forcing a laugh, but it came out weaker than he intended. "And what? That makes you special? Makes you better than everyone else?" Jim shook his head. "Number. It just means I know the cost of things you take for granted." Ethan rolled his eyes, but his confidence was slipping. "Yeah, well, I pay my taxes. That funds the military, doesn't it? So technically, I helped you guys." A few of the locals scoffed. One of the veterans in the back chuckled darkly, shaking his head. Jim didn't even blink. "You think taxes pay for respect?" he asked. Ethan had no answer. Jim took a step closer, forcing Ethan to look up slightly. "You come in here, running your mouth about things you don't understand, about people who lived through things you'll never have to." His voice was calm, deliberate, like a man who had spent his life making difficult decisions without hesitation. "You want to act like this country runs on your money?" Jim gestured toward the old men at the back booth, toward the waitress, toward the people quietly watching. "This country doesn't run on money," Jim said. "It runs on the blood and sweat of the men and women who stand between you and the people who would tear it all down." Ethan swallowed, his pulse pounding in his ears. For the first time in his life, he wasn't the one controlling the conversation. Jim let the silence settle before he finally stepped back, shaking his head. "But you wouldn't know that, would you?" Ethan clenched his jaw. "I built my own life. I didn't need to pick up a gun and run off to war to be successful." Jim studied him for a long moment, then smirked. "You built something for yourself, huh?" Jim said. "Good for you. But what you don't realize is, without men like us, you wouldn't have had the chance to build anything at all." Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. He looked around the diner and saw it, the weight of their stares, the quiet judgment, the realization that no one was on his side. He had walked into the wrong place with the wrong attitude, and now he was the fool standing in front of men who had lived through things he couldn't even imagine. For the first time in his life, he was the one who didn't belong. Jim picked up his coffee, took a slow sip, and then turned away, like Ethan wasn't even worth his time. And that stung more than anything. Ethan Carter had spent his life being the most important person in the room. Now, he was nothing. And he had no one to blame but himself. Ethan Carter sat frozen in place, his face burning as the diner around him seemed to close in. For the first time in his life, he wasn't the smartest man in the room. He wasn't the wealthiest. He wasn't the most powerful. He was nothing. Jim Reynolds had turned his back on him, returned to his booth like Ethan wasn't worth another second of his time. The other veterans did the same, resuming their conversation as if nothing had happened. That was what hurt the most. Not the words, not the quiet judgment from the rest of the diner, but the fact that, in the end, he hadn't even been worth a second thought. Ethan clenched his jaw, trying to will back his confidence, his control. He had always been good at talking himself out of a bad situation, always been able to smooth things over. But this was different. He reached for his coffee, but his hands were unsteady. He barely noticed the waitress still standing there, arms crossed, staring down at him with thinly veiled contempt. "You know," she said, her voice sharp, "I grew up thinking my dad was invincible." Ethan blinked, looking up at her. "Hello, Mr. Pictures here, and before we continue with the story, please subscribe to the channel as it would allow me to continue with these stories. Thank you. Now, back to the story." She gestured toward the veterans at the booth, but her eyes stayed on him. "He was deployed in Afghanistan when I was 8. He sent me letters, called when he could, and then one day, a Marine came to my door and handed my mom a folded flag." Her voice stayed calm, but her grip on the rag in her hands tightened. "My dad died, so men like you could sit in a diner and run your mouth about how washed up these guys are." Ethan swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. The weight of the room was pressing down on him, but it wasn't the kind of weight he could ignore. This was the weight of truth. I didn't know," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. The waitress scoffed. "That's the problem with people like you. You never know. You don't have to. and you don't care until someone shoves it in your face." She turned and walked away, leaving him alone with the crushing reality of what he had just done. The door to the diner swung open, and the sound of boots against the wooden floor made Ethan glance up. A man in a sheriff's uniform stepped inside, adjusting his belt, scanning the room. His eyes landed on Jim first, then flicked to Ethan. "You're lucky you're just passing through," the sheriff muttered as he walked past, taking a seat at the counter. "This town doesn't take kindly to people who don't know how to keep their mouths shut." Ethan's pulse pounded. His entire body felt hot, but it wasn't from anger, it was from shame. Jim hadn't threatened him, neither had the other veterans, but their silence was worse than any threat could have been. He had come in, acted like an entitled idiot, and now he was being told, without a single raised voice, that he didn't belong here. And he knew they were right. He took a deep breath, running a hand through his hair. His instinct was to get up, walk out, pretend none of this had ever happened. But he couldn't, because for the first time in his life, he wanted to make it right. Ethan stood, ignoring the eyes that followed him, as he walked toward Jim's table. The older man didn't look up as Ethan stopped beside him. The veterans continued talking, laughing lightly over some old story, like Ethan wasn't even standing there. He took a deep breath. "I was out of line." Jim didn't react. Ethan shifted on his feet. "I was an arrogant jerk. He let out a slow breath. "I thought I knew everything. I don't." Jim finally looked up. His sharp blue eyes studied Ethan for a long moment, as if deciding whether or not he was worth the time. The silence stretched. Ethan cleared his throat. "I don't expect you to forgive me. He hesitated, feeling the weight of his own words before finishing. "I just needed to say it." Jim nodded once. Not an acceptance, not a rejection, just an acknowledgement. Ethan stood there for another second, then turned to walk away. But before he could take another step, Jim's voice stopped him. "You in a hurry, son?" Ethan turned, frowning. "What?" Jim gestured to the empty seat across from him. "Sit down." The veterans at the booth exchanged amused glances, but said nothing. Ethan hesitated. "Are you serious?" Jim smirked. "You said you don't know everything." He picked up his coffee. "Maybe it's time you learned something." The tension in Ethan's chest loosened just slightly. He nodded, then slowly sat down. The waitress came back, raising an eyebrow at the sight of him at Jim's table. Jim lifted his cup toward her. "Rosie, bring the kid a coffee. Looks like we got some educating to do." She smirked, shaking her head. "Coming right up." Ethan didn't know what he was about to hear, but for the first time in his life, he was ready to listen. The clink of a fresh coffee cup on the table pulled Ethan Carter further into uncharted territory. He had walked into Rosie's diner with all the confidence of a man who thought he had life figured out. Now, he sat across from Jim Reynolds, a man who had lived through hell and come back carrying stories that men like him would never understand. The other veterans at the booth watched with quiet amusement, leaning back in their seats, waiting to see how this played out. They had seen plenty of young men with loud mouths and small minds, but few who were willing to sit down and actually listen. Ethan cleared his throat, unsure how to start. "I don't really know what I'm supposed to say." Jim smirked, taking a sip of coffee. "Good, means you're finally thinking before you speak." Ethan exhaled, nodding. "Guess I deserve that." Jim set his cup down and folded his hands in front of him. "Son, let me ask you something. What do you do for a living?" Ethan straightened, falling into familiar ground. "I run a financial consulting firm. Started it from the ground up. I handle investments for some of the biggest companies in the country." Jim nodded, seemingly unimpressed. "So you make rich people richer?" Ethan frowned slightly. "I help businesses grow." Jim tapped a finger on the table. "And if you fail? If you make a mistake, what happens?" Ethan shrugged. "Worst case, a client loses money. Maybe I lose a contract." Jim leaned forward slightly. "You ever make a mistake that costs a life?" Ethan froze, his breath catching in his throat. Jim let the silence settle before continuing. "Because I have, and so have every man at this table." Ethan's eyes flicked to the other veterans, men who had held the weight of life and death in their hands, men who had made choices in the heat of battle that they could never take back. Jim's voice was softer now, but no less firm. "You think success is about money, about power, but real success, Real power, it's about responsibility. Ethan swallowed. I have responsibilities. Jim nodded. Maybe. But have you ever had to carry the weight of someone else's survival? Ever had to stand between a bullet and a man who trusted you to bring him home? Ethan didn't answer, because he knew he didn't have to. Jim sat back. You're a smart kid, probably worked hard to get where you are, but you walked in here acting like that made you better than the people who bled for your right to sit in this seat. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, his pulse pounding. I never thought about it like that. Jim smirked. I know. He took another sip of coffee. That's why we're having this conversation. The waitress Rosie came by and topped off their cups, her expression still skeptical but softer than before. She lingered for a moment, watching Ethan, then finally spoke. You ever been to a veterans hospital? Ethan looked up at her, caught off guard. No. You should go, she said simply. Go talk to a guy missing his legs, or a woman who's learning to walk again after an IED blast. Go see the real price of freedom, then tell me if you still think these guys just talk about the past to feel important. Ethan felt his stomach twist. Jim let Rosie's words hang for a moment before leaning forward again. You know what the hardest thing is about coming home from war? Ethan shook his head. Jim's voice was quieter now, almost reflective. It's realizing that the world kept moving without you, that the things you fought for, the people you protected, don't even know you exist. The weight of that truth settled on Ethan's chest like a boulder. For so long, he had measured his worth by money, by power, by the illusion of control. But sitting across from Jim, he realized how little any of that actually mattered. I was wrong, Ethan admitted, his voice raw. About all of it. Jim studied him for a moment, then nodded. Yeah, you were. Ethan exhaled, shaking his head with a bitter laugh. You don't sugarcoat things, do you? Jim chuckled. Not my style. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming against the coffee cup. How do I fix it? Jim raised an eyebrow. Fix what? This. Ethan gestured around him, frustration creeping into his voice. The way I've been thinking, the way I've been living. How do I change? Jim smiled, but it wasn't condescending. It was the smile of a man who had seen young men search for meaning before. You start by shutting up and listening, Jim said, and then you do something with what you've learned. Ethan nodded slowly. Jim pushed his coffee aside and stood up. Come on, kid. Ethan frowned. Where are we going? Jim grabbed his coat. You're coming with me to the Veterans Center. If you really want to fix it, start there. Ethan hesitated, then stood. He pulled out his wallet, but Rosie shook her head. Don't worry about it, she said. That lesson you just got? Priceless. Ethan smiled, nodding. Yeah, it was. As he followed Jim out of the diner, stepping into the afternoon sun, he realized something profound. For the first time in his life, he wasn't thinking about what he could gain. He was thinking about what he could give. And maybe, just maybe, that was the first step toward becoming a man worth remembering. The end.